I am a reporter with TSN, and I've been with TSN since 2013. Privilege of covering most of the major North American sports leagues and also covered in Olympics, and been able to see the different kinds of cultures, not just on the playing field, but in the locker room as well. And you can see over time that there certainly is a different culture. There are certain expectations that are different within each locker room. I think of hockey and the unwritten code versus the basketball locker room and kind of the reputation or the rep one player has perhaps over a rookie or someone else. Those on the surface can be endearing to that particular sport and its culture. Over time, however, you can understand when not only talking with players, with fans and those around those particular sports, that those expectations within a locker room, within that culture, can give off certain implicit biases, not necessarily with respect to skin color, but also perhaps in terms of those already in the sport, certain expectations, environmental expectations, cultural expectations that are put on certain athletes that are already in the sport, and particularly those outside the sport. And what do I think that sports can do to better add diversity, to better expand or perhaps lower some of the perceived barriers and implicit biases? I think we are at a time now where all the major sports leagues, particularly in North America, should be in constant communication with one another. We saw it last May with the murder of George Floyd and the effect that had on the NBA bubble, and what the Milwaukee Bucks did, which sent a ripple effect across all of the leagues. Now, perhaps all the leagues didn't go ahead and postpone their games all at once, but I'm hoping that a situation like that over time helps to go ahead and foster communication, because I think that's key. Every sport's going to be different naturally. I talk about hockey and basketball. Football is very different as well. I mean, you have guys coming from different backgrounds, different shapes, different sizes, different positions, different expectations on each of their positions. But what's so great about football, and I'm not using it as the be all and end all, mind you, is that you kind of come in and guys are coming in from all over the place, and it really is you're based upon the ability, you are judged upon the ability that you offer. I think we need to get beyond the physical abilities, and we need to start tapping into what athletes offer as individuals, embracing and accepting a player's individualism, not necessarily to harm the sense of team and community and common purpose towards winning a game or winning a championship, mind you. But I think it really is about all these leagues coming together, not just giving voice to the athletes, but also voice to those around the games, the coaches, executives. Because even though it sounds very basic, having communication, being able to have difficult conversations, being able to give everyone involved in the sport the opportunity to say things and express themselves, I think is eminently crucial, because you don't get off the mark, you don't start progress until people start having difficult conversations. An example could be one particular player's view of a joke or criticism or an expectation of a certain teammate might come across to that teammate in a way that is psychologically harmful and emotionally harmful. And given the current times that we're living in, transparency and communication has to be, it starts in the locker room and it spreads out, but it also has to be top down between all the leagues so they meet in the middle. We need to and continue to look for talent and content creation on the education side of it in places that we wouldn't necessarily look to before. There are so many platforms now, so many ways that fans and creative minds are engaging in sports. I think that education institutions to start have to go out there and go into those communities. I think it must be active on those on the part of institutions to go out and really interact with. I would use Ryerson as an example. It's going to be interesting to see when you're taking a look at a program like the College of Sports Media, Ryerson's Radio and Television Arts Sports Media program, the ability for that program to go to high schools, to go to students and really engage with them, because some students off the start, certain BIPOC students, LGBTQ students, don't necessarily feel accepted in sports, might be sports fans, but don't feel accepted, might feel that there's a certain expectation of a sports media program in which they have to look a certain way, act a certain way, display a certain way. And it really would mean something if that program or those people had the opportunity to actually engage with those institutions. And maybe it's the sport media programs going to high schools or college and university fairs and really engaging with those students and having them feel like their creative tools can add to, not necessarily have to meet the expectation of some prerequisites, not just in terms of marks, but I'm talking about in terms of how one talks about, discusses, interacts with, and creates content for sports. In terms of the sports leagues, it's the same thing. So often sports has been an avenue of, well, you come to the playing surface, come to us, show us what you have, and then we will judge whether or not you're worthy actually of taking part in the game. The game now has to come to a number of places and people and interact with them, give something back to them. That's critical because it's not just so much. You take a look at the Toronto Argonauts. They've long had a anti-bullying campaign. You see what the work that MLSE is doing with MLSE Launchpad. Those are first iteration kinds of initiatives. I think sports leagues should be doing more. Certainly the NBA has a long history of engaging communities out in Scarborough. They've been doing it long before the Toronto Raptors were prominent, and certainly have even increased. So NFL Canada does the same thing. These are the first iterations of getting out there and here's the sport and be part of the sport and let's play. But I think now, especially in BIPOC communities, especially LGBTQ communities, it's not just sports. It's those sports leagues coming to communities, coming to events, not just about here's a ball, here's how you play the game, come play the game with us. It's engaging in more fulsome discussions about what those communities face, about investing in those communities, not just for here's a basketball net and here's a hockey arena, but engaging with those community leaders and understanding them on their level. Because whether you live out in Prince Edward Island, in Summerside, whether you live out in New Brunswick, whether you live out in northern Quebec, whether you live out in Malvern or Rexdale or Thornhill, Ontario, it doesn't really matter. Every community is different, and these sports leagues, as we move into an era that is far more diverse, where people have a stronger voice, I really think for sports leagues to continue to want to be prominent and proactive, you have to go to those communities and engage in them with initiatives that are far beyond just, hey, why don't you come and play the game with us? First start off with, I think, how reporters, producers, content creators engage with athletes. So often that trust, building that trust, is a central tenet of what we do as journalists. It's a long, difficult process. And it's a long, difficult process because it requires time. And building trust is something that doesn't happen overnight. And I really think in this world where we spend so much time worrying about clicks and likes and interactions, that real one-to-one interaction with an athlete is something that journalists especially when educating a young journalist, which is something that you really have to take into consideration, because an athlete is not simply going to share his or her story because you ask them to. They're going to share their story after you take the time to learn who they are. I can tell you, I have had many situations when I was younger as a journalist where I thought that I had built enough trust with someone on a surface level that I could tell a story, and then realizing that I had completely missed the point and not necessarily engaged with them on a deeper level to which they actually did trust me. And that trust is about not, immediately going ahead and, that trust is immediately not thinking that a headline is going to change the world. It's not immediately thinking that a tweet is going to change the world. It's not necessarily thinking that one interview is going to change the world. It takes time. And when it takes time, that's important. And because there's such an importance to that investment and that time that you take to build trust with athletes, when you realize that you built a trust with one particular athlete, you realize within that community that athlete will start speaking about you as a journalist, start speaking about your process. Now, on a fuller scale, in terms of what networks can do, in terms of what entire media properties can do, well, it really is all about how you speak. It's about the content that you're pushing out there. It's about the kind of editorial considerations you have with every single bit of content that you create. I know at TSN, we're doing quite a lot of work with our diversity and inclusion committee, and I'm on the editorial committee, and we're trying to develop a more proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. And that proactive approach is not just looking at the stories that are happening that day, but looking at where the trends are going, looking at a particular month and what it's honoring, taking a look at a particular team, taking a look at a particular player, and trying to draw connections to where the world is currently in terms of a particular group and what they might be dealing with, what particular athlete from a particular group might be dealing with. You really have to be thinking in three dimensions. You can't just simply react all the time when there's a soundbite or a clip, because that doesn't build trust. What really builds trust is when athletes, and I can tell you, having received many messages from many athletes, when they start to see that you're taking the initiative and you're seeing where the tide is going, and you're reaching out and you're actually trying to do the work to build that trust and to do the research and to do the work that just can't be fit into a tweet, as I mentioned, or an Instagram post or a TikTok post or, a chat on Clubhouse. It's really, really that investment. Athletes see it. And so when something big does happen, when you do have to react to something, that trust is there. It's a long, long process. It is never something that could be changed overnight. But from a macro perspective, a media investment in terms of content creation, in terms of the perspective that you have and how you generate content and the voices, the diversity of voices, not just in front of camera, but the producers, making an investment in that helps to build that trust, so that on a micro level, you see it's a lot easier for journalists and producers to go out into the field to build those relationships. It is critical. It's basic journalism, but it needs a lot more attention, especially now. Much like different sports, I think that we oftentimes believe that a sports journalist, a sports broadcaster, a producer has to look a certain way, has to have a certain set of experiences, has to be an almanac for sports knowledge. I think we're getting to a point where the numbers really don't matter. Stats are great. There's a certain niche within the sports media landscape that is completely and justifiably serviced by sabermetrics. And I think that's critical and it's key, and it shouldn't be diminished. But the stats just don't matter on their own. We've come back to a point, and journalism was very much like this in the old days of reporters like Grantland Rice and W.C. Hines, where there was this investment in the personality of the athlete. Now, oftentimes, given the context of those times, there were certain liberties taken in terms of going back to implicit biases and certain observations, liberties that were taken with those observations, but it was still very much about investing in trying to give an athlete a voice. And I think some of those, at least the principles of that, are still true now. It's very easy to go ahead and think that the numbers matter solely, but it's really about the stories of the athletes. It's a complete there's a 180-degree difference between now the numbers that you see on the court and the lives of the athletes off of it. We're starting to see certain media organizations, whether it be the Uninterrupted, whether it be Complex, whether it be Bleacher Report Sneakers, that looks at the athlete as a more holistic, layered individual. And I think we have to continue to go and pursue that, because what matters is showing athletes as the layered, complex individuals they are, especially how they relate to certain situations. And as a concrete example, we're coming up to the year anniversary, as I mentioned before, of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's murder as well, and that effect, that completely that paradigm shifting effect that it had on athletes, how they view themselves and how they interact with the world. I think we need to not revisit it, but we need now to take it from that one iteration, which was being proactive and reactionary, to now, as I, not to repeat myself, that investment, we need to double down on our investment to make sure that athletes and those involved in sports know that there are platforms for them to tell their stories. I think media can play a role in terms of, I don't want to say demand, but I think we can do more in terms of putting the expectation back onto leagues like the NFL, MLS, NBA, NHL, MLB, to say to them that the time has come to look past, to go back to a previous answer, certain expectations, certain implicit expectations of a culture and what an executive should look like, should sound like, should feel like. I think we've come to a point now where we should expect more. We should want more. We should desire more, and we should put that pressure on, because we want to get to a point where the NHL putting a women's national team player like Bridget Lequette on their women's advisory panel isn't news. That it's there because, of course, it's there. That what Dawn Staley is doing as the head coach of the South Carolina women's basketball team, as she herself says during March Madness, it shouldn't be news that I have an opinion. It's just, hey, I'm here. I'm using my platform. We can speak about the game. We can speak about anything else, and that it's not. It's not incredibly life-changing all the time, that it's not necessarily mundane, but it becomes a part of our process, that women and women of color, LGBTQ plus executives, athletes can feel like, hey, they have a certain amount of allyship within within the sports media. It is certainly a tricky. It's certainly a tricky line to walk across, because you get into the realm of objectivity versus subjectivity. But I think, given the times that we're in, we always have to be very careful of being so rigid in what's objective and what's subjective. I think we need to realize that this world that we're living in now is a world where there is a lot of work and understanding and complex discussions happening. Never should we ever be, as I mentioned before, about knee-jerk tweets and knee-jerk reactions in terms of building trust with an athlete. With respect to how can we in media better advance or try to inspire those within sports organizations, sports leagues, and sport executives. We have to understand that it's a process, and that when we're asking questions, tough questions, that we understand it's going to take time. and that I think it's really critical to not just go ahead and think, well, it's okay to just the status quo is okay, and one woman being a ref at the Super Bowl, or one woman coming off the bench for the San Antonio Spurs and coaching that one time is enough. It's about demanding more. It's about expecting more, because sports should always be inclusive. It's a terrible, predictable cliche, but that inclusivity has to come with work. And the drivers of that, through content creation, through editorials, through production decisions, has to be completely driven by sport media, from the institution, the educational institution, all the way through the newsroom. Trust, because those in power believe power will be taken away from them because they don't trust the process. And those who feel excluded don't trust that the process is there to help them out. And that, with trust comes conversation, comes communications, have already discussed, but trust is singularly important. It's eminently important. And that trust is built through honest conversation and communication and transparent discussions. And those in power need to trust that it's not about taking power away from one singular person or one singular entity or one singular position. It's about adding to that power structure. It's about including people in that power structure. From a sport perspective, perhaps it's not there being one singular commissioner involved in communications and negotiations with all of the various team presidents or league board of directors. Perhaps it's a group of individuals, qualified, talented individuals, who make up a brain trust that leads organizations to more inclusive and more dynamic thinking, given the times that we live in. And on the other side, as I said, we've talked about it already. I mean, trust is so singularly important from those who feel outside of sports and outside of that group. I think them trusting that there's a place for them, trusting that they're going to be included, trusting that there are those who want to bring them in. I think it's incredibly important, because if they don't feel that trust, if they don't feel the trust in the process, then it's a self-defeating exercise, because they just will not feel like that there's a place for them. And certainly both sides then, as we've seen in multiple, political, social, economic discussions, there's distrust. And when there's distrust, I mean, it's completely destructive. So trust takes time. This is not something that can be solved with one singular discussion or symposium or list of objectives. These things have to be acted upon, and it takes a lot of time. We've seen it from, the 1960s and Muhammad Ali's protests to all the way through to where we are now. I mean, that's 50, 60 years of constant, hard, sometimes painful work. And there has to continue to be a real vigilance in trying to build trust. And it's not easy. If I had the blueprint for it, I would lay it out. But trust, not that terrible 76ers cliche, trust the process, but working on trust, building trust, and trying to go ahead and tear down those levels of distrust, because it is literally toxic. And we've seen it happen before. We saw it with the NFL, with Colin Kaepernick. It can be destructive and disingenuous. So trust is an absolute key component in that. I mean, they all go hand in hand. You can't have diversity and inclusion without accountability. And accountability is the first pillar, I believe. because what has happened before, those implicit biases need to be spoken about, because you don't get to the other two important steps unless there are people that recognize a singular person or an entire league that recognize that the way things were done just won't cut it anymore. In particular, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, I think of the NHL and its relationship with the Hockey Diversity Alliance, and that in and of itself, going back to that discussion about trust. I mean, that's to build trust, it's rooted in accountability. It's rooted in accountability of understanding that the process didn't work at all before, or didn't make people feel included before. And so that now it's incredibly important now to make sure that those people feel that they can get to that they can be in a space where someone like Akim Aliu can speak honestly about what he's endured. That there are other athletes who don't feel like, well, if I don't speak up, irrespective of the color of their skin, that I'm going to be marginalized and rejected and shunned. Accountability is not necessarily a witch hunt. Accountability is not necessarily some kind of desire for punishment. Accountability is conversation. Accountability is transparency. Accountability is this process and this continuing desire to want to open up to want to continue to open up lines of communication, because diversity and inclusion, I mean, diversity being, or I would think inclusion is the next one, because as I mentioned before, sports should be an open door. Sports has always been, if you're going to judge it based upon what you offer, well, then it should be how many people from how many backgrounds can offer. And we've seen it, over the last, look at the progress that we've made, look at the content that we've created, look at the discussions we've had over the course of 10 months. It really is spectacular to see. I've had discussions with athletes, difficult discussions with athletes, in which their own perception of the world and how it works has changed completely. And it's really difficult for them sometimes to kind of understand what the world looks like outside the playing surface. But that's okay. Accountability and inclusion, that second one, is about bringing people in so that you learn and understand. It's not necessarily an inquisition. It's not necessarily, trying to tear down old power structures. It's trying to add, to get to that third point, diversity. Because what I love so much about, we use you can obviously always use the Olympic Games as an example, or any major sporting event as an example, and the plurality of voices that you see on the surface. But what I'm heartened by, at least now, is from a content creation standpoint, the amount of collaboration that happens. And I think that's the important thing when it comes to diversity, is collaboration and the willingness and desire to keep collaborating. And, just to kind of have that thought experiment that I was discussing before, if you have a league that doesn't necessarily rely on a commissioner, but has certainly, someone could say it's a board, they already have a board of governors, but has a collective of a couple people who represent diverse backgrounds, to not just look at the sports as a singular, how much money can we make for this franchise through this marketing campaign or this television deal, but how can we be agents for change outside of the playing surface, and still, through capitalist principles, still see it as a money-making endeavor. That's great. And then from the team's perspective, well, we're in a community. We can micro focus this on a hyper local level. And we've seen teams do it. We've seen teams, look at what teams did and particular leagues did and particular owners did in terms of voting. Make arenas and stadiums voting centers. I mean, that's one way to do it. You could, potentially look at turning big stadiums into big community centers, perhaps not all the time, but for community events. We've seen that done before. And then from, you talk about a player's perspective and a media perspective, I mean, they're all partners. Why can't a television station or a media company that has an investment in a team be a part of that initiative of bringing people in, that it's not just, as I said before, hey, come out and bring your kids to try out to play basketball, but engaging people far beyond the game with cultural events. I mean, we could see everything that's going on with Stop Asian Hate. Why can't a team go ahead and go into that community, not visibly saying, passing out. I think we've all seen the video a couple of days ago of the lovely elderly Asian woman getting a jersey from Danny Green, and that's great. That's one way of doing it. There's another way of doing it where you can actually go ahead and engage with somebody on multiple levels and engage with communities on multiple levels to make it feel like they have ownership in that team. They have a certain amount of not just cultural ownership, but they have a personal ownership in that team because that team is invested. So accountability is the first thing in terms of, I guess, to wrap up my thought here, accountability is starting the conversation. Diversity is expanding the conversation. Inclusion is, I'll start it again. Accountability is starting the conversation. Inclusion is opening the conversation. Diversity is continuing to expand that conversation. And I think at every level, from sport media to sports ownership, I think all of those principles should be ones that are considered with every major decision-making process. When we go back to those pillars of accountability, inclusion, and diversity, everything's based on trust. And I've said it, I don't know how many times. Trust is important because it's a process in which people kind of understand each other. And let's start from the bottom in terms of what we're doing right now and having this discussion. I'm a former Ryerson student and you're a Ryerson student. And that's where the discussion starts in terms of building a trust, not just in our sports opinions about who's the GOAT or who scored more goals or who would have been better in this situation versus that situation. It's understanding and seeing sports from two different lenses. And then you go from, given that we're in the content creation realm, you go into the classroom and you go into idea generation and content generation. And you really understand that trust is about saying, okay, you know what, I have a perspective. Okay, I have an idea. I want someone to trust that I can execute it in a very unique way, and getting that trust from an instructor or from the institution itself. And that's, trust there's a bit of risk in trust, right? Because if you don't trust it, if you're not taking a bit of risk, then you're really not trusting what that individual or what that institution or really what that piece of content can offer. And for as content creators, when we're taking that risk to build trust, then it stretches out to the athlete, because you're investing time in listening to that athlete and wanting to create content that is not necessarily important to that athlete, but that can be important to the audience as well. And it sounds like it's a very general term, but building trust with an athlete also helps you build trust with an audience, because if the athlete trusts you, if an athlete trusts you to come out of the closet, then you're known, and that interaction is known, and that piece of content is known to then be something that's trustworthy within that community. It's not just because it's that athlete, it's because it's a prominent person who wants to go ahead and share their story. So that itself generates trust with the audience. And then as you get further up the chain, going especially to that point of accountability, trusting an athlete to go ahead and speak their mind, knowing that it's not necessarily going to disrupt what's going on the playing surface. That's the kind of trust that it needs to be experienced on the executive level with organizations, needs to be experienced on executive level with teams and ownership. That's what this process is about. We speak so often about breaking down of power structures and wanting to go ahead and revolutionize the way we think of things. Well, how does that start? It's very easy to go ahead and criticize and condemn, and sometimes maybe it's appropriate. But the tougher, more worthwhile endeavor is building trust, whether you're a student trying to go ahead and really develop your own voice and your own personality and your own interactions with with the Ryerson School of Sports Media, or whether you're myself, someone who works for an organization that like TSN that's trying to get them to trust him to take on a project that requires me to get the trust of an athlete, which is going to take time. But in that sense, if the athlete trusts me, then perhaps it shows and that generates trust within the audience and brings an audience in by gaining that trust. Then it shows major sports teams and major sports leagues that accountability, inclusion, and diversity is all worth it. So, trust is, I think everything I've said comes back to that. And it's a long process. It's a difficult process. It requires time and perspective and patience. And trusting that patience and that time and perspective is incredibly important.